in a quiet house on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, a woman lay listening to a wind she had heard all her life, unable to tell whether it was the moor outside or something letting go inside her. It was the last week of March, 1855. The room was cold, and the light at the window had the thin, gray quality of a year not yet decided on spring. She was 38 years old, and for most of those years she had been the one who stayed. Others had left this house in coffins, one after another, until only she and her father remained. Now she lay in the bed she had once shared with her sisters, and the silence of the parsonage pressed against the walls like water against a hull. Downstairs, a man she had married only 9 months before sat with his head in his hands. He had not slept. Through the floorboards came the small sounds of a household trying to be quiet, and she listened to them the way she had once listened for her sister's footsteps on the stairs. She had been sick for weeks, unable to keep down food or water, growing thinner inside a body that should have been carrying new life. The doctors murmured among themselves and offered little. One can only wonder what she made of it. This woman who had spent her whole life turning suffering into pages, now lying past the reach of words. There was a manuscript she had begun that winter, a few pages only, set aside on a desk in another room. It would never be finished. The pen had been capped, the ink had dried, and the story it might have told went with her into the dark. Her name, by then, was known in London drawing rooms and New York bookshops, spoken by readers who had never seen her face. They knew her by a man's name first, a name she had chosen to hide behind. Few of them imagined the small, plain woman in this remote house above a graveyard. She had written one of the most beloved novels in the English language, and she had done it surrounded by death, in a village where the water ran foul from the churchyard, and children rarely lived to grow old. How a voice so fierce came out of so much grief is the question her life keeps asking. To understand the woman in that bed, you have to go back, before the fame and the loss, to a house full of children and a father who let them read everything. You have to go back to a winter morning and a box of wooden soldiers. The parsonage at Haworth stood at the top of a steep stone village, its windows facing the churchyard on one side, and the open moor on the other. Patrick Bronte, an Irish clergyman who had risen from poverty through sheer stubbornness, had brought his family here in 1820. Within 2 years his wife was dead. Maria Bronte died in September 1821, after a long illness, when Charlotte was 5. The house that had held a mother now held her absence, and the children learned early that the moor and the graveyard were the two horizons of their world. Their aunt came from Cornwall to raise them, a careful woman who never quite warmed the cold rooms. There were 6 children, Maria and Elizabeth, the eldest, then Charlotte, then the only boy, Branwell, then Emily, then little Anne. They were close in the way that children become close when the world outside is small, and the world inside is all they have. Their father did an unusual thing for his time. He let them read Byron, Milton, the newspapers, the political quarrels of the day. All of it passed through the parsonage and into their minds. Branwell shared the books his sisters were not permitted at the village library, and the children grew clever and strange together. In 1824, Patrick sent his 4 eldest daughters to a school for clergymen's children at Cowanbridge. It was cheap, and it was cruel. The food was poor, the rooms were cold and damp, and disease moved through the dormitories without resistance. The following year, the 2 eldest girls, Maria and Elizabeth, fell ill there, and were sent home only to die. Charlotte was 9. She watched the 2 sisters who had been almost like mothers to her carried out of the world within weeks of each other, and she never forgot the school that had broken them. Years later, that school would reappear in her most famous book, renamed Lowood, where small girls shiver and starve, and one of them dies in the narrator's arms. She wrote it from memory. The cruelty in those pages was not invented. After her sisters' deaths, the 4 remaining children drew tighter still. Charlotte, Branwell, Emily, and Anne were brought home, and the parsonage became their entire universe. With so little to do and so much grief to outrun, they did the thing they would do for the rest of their lives. They made worlds. It began one June morning in 1826, when their father brought home a box of 12 wooden soldiers for Branwell. Charlotte remembered it exactly, leaping out of bed, snatching up the tallest and finest of the figures, and crying out that this one was the Duke of Wellington, and he should be hers. Out of a child's game came something that would shape every year that followed. The soldiers became kingdoms, the kingdoms became sprawling sagas written in tiny script and handmade books no bigger than a palm. Charlotte and Branwell built an empire called Angria Emilian and built one called Gondel. For years they wrote their secret histories, and the habit of invention sank into Charlotte so deeply that she once feared she could not live without it. As she grew, the question of how a woman might actually live began to press on her. There was no money. A clergyman's daughter without fortune had only a few respectable roads, and nearly all of them led to other people's houses. At 15, she was sent away again, this time to a better school called Roe Head. At Roe Head she found two friends who would matter for the rest of her life, Ellen Nissy and Mary Taylor. They remembered a tiny, short-sighted girl in old-fashioned clothes who could not play ball games or read music, but who drew beautifully and spoke of poetry. She was an outsider, and she knew it, and she carried it like a second skin. She left to teach her younger sisters, then returned to Roe Head as a teacher herself, and discovered that she hated it. The work was dull, the pupils were dull, and her mind kept slipping away to Angria, to the bright impossible world she carried inside her. She wrote in stolen moments, her eyes shut, the words spilling onto the page in letters almost too small to read. In December 1836, just before her 21st birthday, she did something bold. She wrote to Robert Southey, the poet laureate, sending him her verses and confessing her ambition to be, as she put it, forever known. His reply was kind, and it was crushing. Literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, he wrote, and it ought not to be. She copied his letter out and kept it. She did not stop writing. The years that followed were a slow education and disappointment. To earn her keep, Charlotte became a governess, the fate of so many educated, penniless women. She entered other people's homes to teach other people's children, and found the position almost unbearable. She was neither family nor servant, but something uneasy in between, expected to be invisible and grateful at once. In one household, a child threw a Bible at her head. She would remember that, too, and give it later to a fictional girl named Jane. The humiliation went deep. In her letters to Ellen she complained of her employer's coldness, their casual contempt, the way they looked through her as though she were furniture. She was a woman of fierce intelligence trapped in a role designed to suppress it, and the friction of that wrongness never left her. Then came an idea that seemed, for a while, like a way out. If the sisters could acquire enough learning, they might open a school of their own, and be beholden to no one. To do that, Charlotte and Emily would need languages. And so, in 1842, Charlotte did something almost no woman of her circumstances did. She left England. Brussels was a city of bells and grey stone, and a language she did not yet command. The two sisters entered a boarding school run by a married couple, the Heegers, teaching a little in exchange for their lessons. For Charlotte, it was the widest the world had ever opened, and the most dangerous. The school was directed by Constantin Heeger, a sharp, demanding, brilliant man who pushed her writing as no one ever had. She described him in a letter as a little black ugly being, choleric and irritable, his face shifting between an insane tomcat and a delirious hyena. She wrote it as a joke. It did not stay a joke. She had found, for the first time, a mind that took her seriously and met it as an equal. He corrected her essays, argued with her, sharpened her. Somewhere in that exchange, admiration deepened into something she could not control and could not confess, for he was married, and his wife ran the school. When her aunt died in the autumn of 1842, the sisters were called home. Emily stayed in Haworth, but Charlotte went back to Brussels alone in early 1843, drawn by a longing she barely understood. It was the loneliest year of her life. Madame Heeger grew cool and watchful. Charlotte's letters to her tutor afterward burned with feeling and the ache of waiting for replies that came rarely or not at all. He tore the letters up. His wife retrieved the pieces and sewed them back together, and so they survived, the record of a passion that went nowhere and changed everything. She came home to Haworth in 1844 with no school, no fortune, and a heart she had to teach herself to govern. She had already, years before, refused a proposal of marriage from Ellen's brother. "I scorn deceit," she had written to him, "and I will never, for the sake of escaping the stigma of an old maid, take a worthy man whom I am conscious I cannot render happy." She meant to live truthfully, even if it meant living alone. So she did what she had always done when life closed its doors. She turned to the page. By now Branwell was sliding into ruin. drinking and drugging himself toward an early grave, and the household that had been her childhood kingdom was darkening around her. One day in the autumn of 1845, Charlotte found a notebook of Emily's poems, and read them without permission. What she found there stopped her breath, verses of such power and strangeness that she knew at once they were no ordinary thing. A door she had thought closed forever swung open again. She persuaded her reluctant sisters into a plan. The three of them would publish together a single book of poems, to hide that they were women, and to escape the prejudice she knew waited for female authors. They would take men's names that matched their own initials. Charlotte became Currer Bell. The book of poems, published in 1846, sold 2 copies. 2. After all the secrecy and hope, the world did not notice them at all. A lesser ambition might have died there, in that silence. Charlotte's did not. She had already turned to prose. Each sister was writing a novel, and Charlotte sent the 3 manuscripts circling through London publishers, bound and posted again. Each time they were returned. Her own first novel, The Professor, was rejected everywhere. The refusals came back like a tide. But one publisher, declining her, did something rare. He wrote that he would be glad to consider a longer, more exciting work, should Currer Bell have one. Most writers would have read only the rejection. Charlotte read the opening. She already had one. She had been writing it through the autumn, a story unlike anything then in print, told in the first person by a small, poor, plain governess who refused to be small in spirit. She finished it, copied it out, and sent it off. Its name was Jane Eyre. Smith, Elder and Company, published it on the 19th of October, 1847, 6 weeks after the manuscript arrived. There had been nothing quite like its voice before, a woman speaking directly, fiercely, claiming her own worth in a world that offered her none. London began to talk. The book was a sensation. It sold and sold. Readers argued over the strange power of it. The plain heroine who would not be silenced, the mad woman locked in the attic, the love that demanded equality before it would accept anything else. No one knew who Currer Bell was. The mystery only fed the fire. For a moment, in the warehouses and the bookshops, it must have seemed that everything she had reached for through 20 years of refusal had finally arrived. The penniless governess had written a book the whole country was reading. But triumph in the Bronte house never came alone, and what followed it that year was not more triumph. Even as Jane Eyre climbed, the parsonage was filling with illness. Branwell, the once gifted brother on whom such hopes had rested, was destroying himself by inches. The boy who had received those wooden soldiers had become a man the family watched with grief and helplessness. In September 1848, Branwell died, his body worn out by drink and laudanum, and his own despair. He was 31. At his funeral, his sister Emily caught a chill standing in the cold church, and the chill went into her lungs and would not leave. Emily had always been the wild one, the one who belonged to the more than to people. Now she began to fade, and she refused, with terrible stubbornness, to see a doctor or rest or admit that anything was wrong. Charlotte watched her sister dying, and was not permitted to call it dying. Emily died on the 19th of December 1848, 3 months after Branwell, of tuberculosis. She was 30. Charlotte had buried a brother and a sister in a single autumn, and the moor wind that Emily had loved kept blowing against the same windows as though nothing at all had changed. There was no time to grieve before the next blow fell, and the youngest, the gentlest, began to show the same signs, the same cough, the same losing battle with the same disease. Charlotte could only watch the pattern repeat itself, helpless, in the house where she had now buried so many, and, unlike Emily, wanted to fight. She wanted to live, and she asked to be taken to the sea at Scarborough, hoping the air might save her. Charlotte took her. They reached the coast, and for a few days, and looked out at the water she had longed to see, and Bronte died at Scarborough on the 28th of May 1849, far from the moor, with Charlotte beside her. She was 29. Charlotte buried her there, alone, away from the family graves, and turned to make the long journey home to a house that now held only her father and the wind. In just over 8 months, she had lost her brother and both her remaining sisters. The 4 children who had built kingdoms together, who had walked round the dining table at night reading their stories aloud, were now one. The table was still there. The footsteps were not. A family servant remembered the sound that came afterward. In the empty evenings, Miss Bronte walking on alone around the dining room table, the way the 4 of them once had together. She walked the same circle. There was no one left to walk it with her. She was now the most solitary kind of survivor, the one who outlives everyone. Her fame was growing in London while her family vanished in Yorkshire, and the two facts sat side by side in her life without ever quite touching. She had everything she had once wanted, and almost no one left to want it for, and yet she wrote. It was, she said, the only way she knew to bear the grief. She finished her novel Shirley in the silence after Eyre's death. Working at the same table she now circled alone, pulling sentences out of a sorrow that had no bottom. In 1850, sorting through her dead mother's papers, she read Maria Bronte's old letters for the first time. I wish, she wrote afterward, that she had lived, and that I had known her. It was the cry of a woman who had spent her whole life saying goodbye, reaching back toward the one goodbye she had been too young to understand. Her identity could not stay hidden forever. The author of Jane Eyre was revealed to be a small, grave, short-sighted woman from a remote parsonage, and London society, hungry to meet her, was largely baffled by what it found. She would not perform, she would not sparkle. At a dinner given by the great novelist Thackeray, gathered guests waited all evening for brilliant conversation from the famous authoress. It never came. She sat quietly on a sofa and murmured to the governess, and her host, defeated by the silence, finally put on his hat and slipped out of his own house to escape it. She was not cold, and she was not dull. She was a woman who had buried almost everyone she loved and learned to live inside herself, and the chatter of literary London had no language for that kind of grief. She gave it her books instead. The books said everything she would not. Then, into that solitary life, came a question she had not expected to face again. Arthur Bell Nichols, her father's curate, a steady and undramatic Irishman who had worked at Haworth for years, told her that he loved her, and asked her to be his wife. Her father was furious. A curate with no fortune, presuming to marry the famous Charlotte Brontë. Patrick took it almost as an insult, and his anger was so violent that Nichols left the parish altogether. Charlotte, caught between her father's rage and her own uncertainty, said nothing yet. She had refused proposals before. She had always chosen solitude over a marriage she could not respect. But this was different, and she knew it slowly. Nichols was not romantic. He was not her intellectual equal in the way Eyre had been. What he was constant. He had loved her quietly for years, and his devotion did not waver, even when her father drove him away. Through letters and patient months, something in her shifted. She was nearly 38, alone in a house with an aging father, the last of all her family. The fierce younger woman who would die rather than marry without adoration had grown into someone who understood what tenderness was worth. She wrote to Ellen of her changing heart, weighing it carefully, as she weighed everything, with honesty rather than romance. She did not pretend to a grand passion. She wrote instead of esteem, of trust, of a good man's steadfast love, and of a loneliness she no longer wished to carry alone. Her father's resistance finally broke. Nichols returned, and Patrick, perhaps seeing at last that his daughter would not be alone in her old age, gave way. The decision, after all the years of refusing, was hers, and she made it with open eyes. She agreed to marry him. After a lifetime of choosing solitude over compromise, of refusing every union she could not honor, she chose at last to be loved by a steady man who asked nothing but to stay. It was not the love of her youthful imaginings. It was, perhaps, something rarer. They were married in the village church at Haworth in June 1854, a quiet ceremony in the place where she had buried nearly everyone she had ever loved. There were no crowds, no fanfare for the famous author, just a small woman, a devoted man, and an old father giving away his last surviving child. To her own surprise, she was happy. The letters she wrote in those first married months carried a warmth her life had rarely allowed her. On the honeymoon in Ireland, she discovered her quiet husband was loved and respected in his own country, and she found, late and unexpected, the simple comfort of belonging to someone. For once, the story seemed to be turning toward light. The woman who had survived everyone, who had carried grief like a second skin, had a home of her own, and a husband who adored her. She had earned, it seemed, a season of peace. She would be given barely 9 months of it. Before her marriage, the world had finally learned who she was and what she had made. Jane Eyre had not faded. It had become a fixture, a book that readers returned to and argued over and pressed into one another's hands. Her last completed novel, Villette, had appeared the year before, drawing once more on Brussels, on longing, on the loneliness she knew better than anyone. Critics who had once sneered at the coarseness of Colonel Bell now bowed to Charlotte Brontë. The plain governess from the moors had walked into the center of English literature and stayed there. What she had written from inside her grief had become something the world could not do without. The strangest part was how unbothered she remained by it. Fame had come too late, and at too high a price to dazzle her. She had wanted, once, to be forever known. And now she was, and the sisters she had wanted to share it with, were under the churchyard grass outside her window. She had given her own life to her characters without ever quite saying so. Lowood was Cowanbridge. The cold governess posts were her own. The longing of Lucy Snow in Villette was the longing she had carried home from Brussels. She had turned every wound into a page, and the pages had outlived the people. Her heroines did the things she had spent her life learning to do. They refused to be diminished. Jane stands before the man she loves and insists on her own equal soul. Lucy endures isolation and builds a life from it. In a century that asked women to be small, Charlotte's women claimed the full size of their feeling. That was the quiet revolution of her work, and it was why readers a century later still found themselves in it. She had written from the position of the overlooked, the plain, the poor, the female, and she had given that position a voice that would not apologize. The world had been waiting for it without knowing. She had drawn it all from the narrow life of a parsonage on the edge of a moor, from a house where the windows looked out on graves. She had never traveled widely, never moved in great events. Her whole material was grief, and longing, and the fierce inner life of a woman the world tried to ignore. In Jane Eyre she had written the line that became her signature across the years: "I am no bird and no net ensnares me, I am a free human being with an independent will." She had written it as a poor governess with no prospects, and no public name. She had made it true by living it. Now, married and briefly happy, she set those battles aside. The fierce ambition had quieted into something gentler. She had a husband who walked the moors with her, a father slowly softening, a household that for the first time in years was not waiting for someone to die. In the winter that followed the wedding, she found she was expecting a child. The woman who had buried 5 siblings and a mother might, against all the odds of that doomed family, begin a family of her own. It was the one future she had never let herself fully imagine. She began, that winter, a new novel. Only a fragment of it survives, a few pages set aside when the sickness came. It is the last writing of her life, broken off mid-thought, the final evidence of a mind that had never stopped making worlds since the morning of the wooden soldiers. For a little while, the long Bronte sorrow seemed to have lifted from one of its children at last. She was loved, she was famous, she was carrying new life through a Yorkshire winter. Then, early in the new year, she began to be ill. The sickness came as a relentless nausea, a body unable to keep down food or water, wasting in the very months that should have been growing strong. What should have been the beginning of a life became, slowly, the ending of one. The doctors came and went and could do little. Her husband nursed her without rest, and her father, who had buried his wife and 5 of his 6 children, prepared to lose the last. The same house, the same wind, the same churchyard waiting below the windows. The pattern that had taken everyone she loved was closing now around her. Modern medicine believes she most likely died of hyperemesis gravidarum, the severe vomiting of pregnancy that, in an age without fluids or relief, could starve a woman to death. Some have pointed instead to the tuberculosis that took her sisters. What is certain is that the pregnancy that promised life became the thing that ended it. In her final days she drifted in and out of awareness, weak past speaking, in the bedroom of the parsonage. There is a moment her biographer recorded, when she half woke to find her husband praying aloud beside her that God would spare her. She is said to have whispered that she was not going to die, that they had been so happy. She was 38 years old. She had outlived her mother, her 2 eldest sisters as a child, her brother and her last 2 sisters as a woman, and now she would not outlive her first year of marriage. The unborn child went with her. Charlotte Brontë died at Haworth on the 31st of March 1855, in the parsonage where she had been brought as a small girl, within sight of the graves of nearly everyone she had loved. The house that had held 6 children now held 1 old man, and a grieving husband, and the wind off the moor, and nothing else. Her father, Patrick, who had married a wife and raised 6 children, was now the last of them all. He had buried every single one. He would live another 6 years in that quiet house, an old clergyman tending the graves of his entire family, the strange and terrible survivor of them all. She was laid in the family vault beneath the church, joining the mother she barely remembered, the sisters and brothers she had watched by one. The walking around the dining table was over. The circle that had once held her was empty now, and the parsonage gave itself back to silence. But the silence did not last. And that is the part of the story she never saw. Within a few years her friend Elizabeth Gaskell wrote her life, and the small grave woman became a legend, the lonely genius of the moors, read and mourned by people who had never known her name in her lifetime. The books did not fade. Jane Eyre is still in print in every language a reader might want, more than a century and a half after a penniless governess posted her manuscript to London, and waited. The voice she gave that small, plain, unbreakable heroine has never gone quiet. People still climb the steep stone street of Haworth to stand in the rooms where the Brontes wrote, to look out the windows at the same churchyard, to walk a little way onto the moor where Emily wandered and Charlotte set her sorrows down. They come for a grief that turned, somehow, into something luminous. What she left was not a record of victories. It was a record of a woman who lost almost everyone and kept reaching for the page, who turned cold schoolrooms and cruel houses and unanswered letters into stories that told other lonely people they were not alone. The grief never left her. She made it into something that could be shared. She had wanted, at 20, to be forever known, and an old poet had told her that literature was no business for a woman. She had kept the letter and kept writing anyway. She had been right, and he had been wrong, and the proof of it sits on shelves in houses she could never have imagined. There is something almost unbearable in the timing of it, the way happiness arrived only at the very end. The way the marriage that finally warmed her was also the thing that took her. 9 months of belonging. After a lifetime of solitude, one can only sit with how thin that margin was, and yet she did get those 9 months. The woman who had refused every union she could not honor was, in the end, deeply loved by a man who never wavered, in the house where she had buried her whole family. Whatever else the story took from her, it gave her that. On a desk in the parsonage, those last unfinished pages were gathered up and put away. A few sentences, breaking off where the sickness stopped her hand. The final words of a writer who had begun in a child's game with wooden soldiers, and who never, in all the years between, stopped making worlds. The wind still comes off the moor and presses against the parsonage windows, the way it did the night she lay listening to it, unable to tell the sound outside from the sound within. It blows over the churchyard where they all lie now, the mother, the children, the writer who outlived them, and made them immortal. She thought she would be forgotten, a plain woman in a remote place who happened to write some books. Instead, her name is spoken every day, somewhere in the world, by someone opening Jane Eyre for the first time, and meeting a voice that will not be diminished. The girl who snatched up a wooden soldier and declared he should be hers grew into a woman who claimed, against everything, the right to her own voice. She lost nearly everything, and turned the losing into art. On a quiet desk, in a quiet house, the last of her words wait, unfinished, as words always are. If the story of Charlotte Bronte stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next life we bring back from the quiet pages of history. There are so many voices like hers, waiting in the silence to be heard again. Stay with us, and we will keep listening for them together.